It is February 9th, 2010. I am Nancy Becker. This is an interview with John Sheridan. It is for the Project on the Governor, Kane Archive, profiling the career and administration of Thomas H. Kane. I'm interviewing John Sheridan, former Commissioner of Transportation during the Kane administration. John's career has spanned more than 40 years in public service, practice of law, and health care. He is currently President and CEO of Cooper Health System in Camden, New Jersey. Before joining Cooper, he was the senior partner and co-chair of the law firm Riker, Danzig, Shearer, Highland, and Peretti, which he joined in 1985. While at Riker, he served for a number of years as counsel to the New Jersey Turnpike Authority. Mr. Sheridan served as Commissioner of Transportation and Chairman of the Board of the New Jersey Transit Corporation from 1982 to 1985. Earlier in his career, he served as Deputy Attorney General and Assistant Counsel to Governor William Cahill and Counsel to the New Jersey Senate Minority. John is a graduate of St. Peter's College and Rutgers Law School. Will you talk to me what your first interest in politics was?
Well, real early, when I was very young, 6 years old, my father was, we lived in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and I remember handing out leaflets for Tip O'Neill's first campaign on the streets. So that was my really first exposure to it. My father wasn't big into politics, but he was interested. He did little things like that in campaigns. So I guess the next thing I remember is I remember listening to both the Democrat and Republican conventions almost in total on the radio in 1952.
So were you born in Massachusetts?
1942, Boston. Grew up in Cambridge till I was 12, and then we moved to New Jersey. My father got transferred down to Kearney. He was in the meatpacking business. I grew up in Bloomfield, went to Catholic school, and then I went to Seton Hall High School, and then I went to St. Peter's College, and then stayed in New Jersey for law school. So I'm the oldest of six, and good Irish Catholic family.
And so when you came to New Jersey, did you continue your interest in politics?
Not really. I would say no. I remember. Not much interest. I was very interested in sports growing up, a little bit less interested in school growing up, but managed to get to the next level at every turn, and just kept going.
So when you graduated, I'm going to skip forward and ask you, when you graduated from law school, did you immediately join the Attorney General's office?
No. I was lucky enough to get a job with Judge Botter in the Superior Court, and I was a late hire. I wasn't quite sure what I was going to do, but I had to get serious because I had just gotten married, and I took a job for like $5,400 a year, and I clerked for Judge Botter, and he was in the law division, and he did a lot of the heavy-duty trials in Bergen County. And the second half of the year, he was on the appellate division, so I had time in both the law division and the appellate division.
So you said you had graduated from law school, you had just gotten married, and where did you live?
West Patterson when we got married. Joyce was from Lincoln Park, and I was from Bloomfield, and we settled sort of between the two families in West Patterson. That was part of my problem. I wound up registered for the draft in Montclair, lived in West Patterson, and was clerking in Bergen County. And I believe this is true. I was the only law clerk that year that got drafted.
And you served in the Army?
2 years, infantry, finally infantry, advanced infantry, learned to fire shoulder-fired missiles in Fort Bliss, Texas, and then I went to Kansas to Fort Riley, and there they plucked me out and put me in the Judge Advocate General's office as a clerk. So I had applied for a commission when I went in. It eventually came through, But by that time I had been in 8 months, and they wanted a 4-year commitment, and I just decided to take my chances. And so I actually didn't go to Vietnam. I served out the rest of my time in Fort Riley.
So when you came back from the Army, what did you do then?
Looked for a job. Had a couple of interviews. The judge, my former judge, tried to help me a little bit, and had a couple of dry runs that didn't work out. And then he had been First Assistant Attorney General, and he said, "Why don't you think about that and go talk to," I think it was Maryland Shower at the time. It was a new administration. George Cahill administration had just started. It was so I interviewed with her and with Attorney General George Kugler, and I got hired. And just to give you an idea about state government, because I think this is really interesting, I was the 42nd Deputy Attorney General at the time. The office had just gone full-time. Before that, you could have a part-time practice. There are now something, I'm guessing, like 1,000 Deputy Attorney Generals.
When you talked about your early years in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and you were giving out literature for Tip O'Neill, so when did you become a Republican?
Well, I actually went into the Cahill administration, but I don't even remember how I was registered at the time. I know how I voted, and I had sort of a checkered history of voting up to the time. I voted for Goldwater in '64, and I voted for Humphreys in '68, and I figured that one out. That doesn't even make any sense. But I guess I was changing my attitudes at the time quite frequently. When I was in the AG's office, I was working there, trying to think, probably about 2 years. But we had moved to Newark when I took the job in the AG's office. We lived in the North Ward, and I used to take the train to Trenton. So I got to meet some people. One in particular, former judge now, Jim Petrella, who was in the Cahill administration, and when there was an opening. And this is kind of interesting. When Richie Weinroth left Governor Cahill's office, they asked me to take his place. And so that's how I got over to the governor's office. And the AG consented to that because he had to, because I had a 3-year commitment to him when I joined the AG's office.
So so you joined the Cahill administration 3 years after being in
No,
the
a couple of
AG's.
years after.
And then what was your job in the Cahill administration?
It was basically to deal with legislation that was there and any problems that came up in certain areas. And my assignments were transportation, health, and BPU, and I'm trying to remember, and insurance. So the legislation was in those areas was in sort of my bailiwick. The counsel's office and the governor's office was very small. We had a chief counsel, which was Pete Garvin, who later became Chief Justice, Jim Petrella, and then three essentially assistant counsel. That's all. That was the entire office. Dave Norcross was special counsel to the governor. He was in the office too.
It was very small.
Right.
So when did you first meet Tom Kean?
As soon as I went to the governor's office. I met Tom Kean before I met Governor Cahill. When I went to it was interesting. I would say I was in the office 6 or 8 months before I met the governor. Just doing my thing. I met Tom Kean because he was the Speaker of the Assembly, and so I had some dealings on certain, but not a lot of meetings. I don't mean to imply that, but I got to see him in action at that time, and he was a young speaker, a young legislator, and had a rapid ascendancy in the Assembly from just one of the regulars to become Speaker, and at a time when in order to make that happen, I believe this is true, it was before I was there, but he basically became Speaker when there was an arrangement cut with the Hudson County Democrats that made him the Speaker. So I didn't realize it at the time, but I obviously realized it later that must have taken a lot of political skill to pull that one off.
When Tom Kean first ran for governor in 1977, were you involved in that campaign at all?
I was, but not with Tom Kean.
Yeah, who did you work for?
I was with, in the primary, I was with Ray Bateman, and supported Ray. I was living, part of it was where I was living. I was a Somerset County resident by that time. I lived in Bound Brook. I was working in Princeton, and I knew Ray better because I worked as counsel to the Senate Republicans after I left the governor's office, and so I knew Ray better than I knew Tom.
And in the 1977 campaign, where Governor Byrne unexpectedly won a second term, Ray Bateman lost the election. What were you doing, or what did you do during that period of time?
I was still counsel to the Senate Republicans part-time, but I had gone up to Princeton when Governor Cahill lost as attorney in the same firm as he did. He joined. So it was Cahill, McCarthy, and Hicks, and I was, for want of a better term, I carried his bag for, whatever files I was asked to work on, I worked on. And after about 4 years, he left, and his son had been in the prosecutor's office and was going into private practice, and the governor went back to his old firm, and I think they were in Haddonfield at the time, but they originally had been in Camden, and was Cahill, Walensky, and Cahill, and around that time I became a partner in McCarthy and Hicks in Princeton, and I was a general practitioner. That's what I did, but I stayed. I was, I had this part-time job as counsel to the Senate Republicans, so I had a good feel of what was going on. I mean, I lived through the income tax issue and the first series of school cases, and so it was. I kind of had a good feel for what was going on and not going on in government.
So let's skip to 1981 and the gubernatorial primary campaign. Were you involved in the gubernatorial primary campaign in 1981?
Yes, but not in a big way, and not with Tom Kean.
And who did you work for?
Pat Kramer.
And Pat Kramer clearly was the candidate that was favored to win in that primary.
He was, and I had known Pat from the Cahill administration. Pat was commissioner of DCA in the Cahill administration, and so I knew him quite well, and I liked him a lot. I thought he was going to win. Little did I know.
Do you want to talk about Kean's victory a little bit in the primary? How did he manage to pull that off?
I don't remember it all that well, but I do remember this part of it. I think is right. Pat Kramer's strategy was to line up all the county chairs, and he had done a good job of it. And Tom, showing his political skill again, managed to get a bill through that basically made an open primary in a lot of counties, and some of the counties that were pledged to Pat, once that happened, couldn't deliver. So his strategy, in the end, didn't work out very well.
So once Tom Kean won the primary,
right.
What was your role then in that campaign?
I had a minor role in the campaign. I worked. Larry Weitzner and I worked on transportation policy. They knew I had 1 year at one of the years when I was, when I went to the governor's office, I was there about a year, and Governor Cahill and Attorney General asked me to go out to transportation. They were having a lot of issues in public transportation, and so at that time there was no New Jersey Transit. The railroads were all in bankruptcy. They asked me to go out there and deal with the commissioner and work right in the commissioner's wing and work, focus on public transit and see if I could help. And I did. And I had a very intense year in public transit in 1973, last year at the Cahill administration.
So the election of 1981
right.
was one of the closest in New Jersey history.
Right.
What was your role during this period of uncertainty when it was not clear who the victor would be?
I would say I had no role. I was available to work on the recount, but I don't recall spending any time on it. I was obviously still counsel to the Senate Republicans during that time, so I was in Trenton a lot, but I don't recall having a role during that period. During the transition period, my name got floated for a couple of different positions. I know some people had suggested to the governor that I would be a good insurance commissioner. I had a little bit of experience in the sense that I had worked through the no-fault bill issues when I was in the governor's office, and particularly on the second round of changes, I probably was the draftsman of most of those changes. Myself and a fellow, you know, Pete Guzzo. Pete Guzzo was in the assembly staff at the time, and so we worked on those issues and got some legislation that they ultimately passed. It kind of fixed a lot of the problems that people were having with the no-fault law. Phil Kaltenbacher was the assemblyman at the time, and a later it might have been Republican chairman under Tom Kaine. I'm now trying to figure the times here. I think so.
I think he was too.
And he was very close to Tom because they were both from Essex County, and Phil was very big on insurance, so I had worked with him on that. So, you know, some people knew that I knew something about this, but I think the name was put in by the president of New Jersey Manufacturers, a fellow named Vince Hoyer, if I recall correctly. And so I got interviewed in that process, along with a bunch of other people. And I had, I know Larry Weitzner, I think Lou Thurston, some other people thought I would be a good commissioner of transportation. And so they had put my name in for that.
I may want to come back and talk about no-fault, because we haven't talked to anyone about no-fault insurance. It was a big issue.
But it was mostly an issue in long before Tom was governor.
Right? And it continued long after he was governor.
Right.
When you were asked to be Commissioner of Transportation, were you surprised? And who asked you?
No. Well, first of all, I was the last cabinet officer appointed, and they had talked to, I knew that they had talked to a lot of people. I didn't know who, but they had done you know, some kind of a national search and had come up with names, and they had done interviews. Ultimately, I recall being interviewed by Tony Ciccatello, Carrie Edwards, Gary Stein, and maybe the three of them, maybe somebody else, I'm not sure. But we had a long interview. I thought, you know, I really thought I had some ideas about what needed to be done and what should do. And as a matter of fact, during the papers that Larry and Weitzer and I had produced during the campaign, the governor actually used them when he went to editorial boards. And he had done, maybe they had done 7 to 10 of these, but I think 3 or 4 of them were good, and he took them with him. And he got almost, I'm not saying it was because of that, but he did work the editorial boards, and I think some of those papers that showed up were helpful in showing that, you know, here's a person of substance, you know. Here's a person who's thinking about what he's going to do when he's governor. He's got some ideas about what to do. And so to that extent, I think what Larry and I did made some contribution.
How old were you at the time?
39.
And your experience basically in transportation was not vast.
Was
not vast.
Oh, not vast for sure. No, I had, you know, I dealt with the issues when I was in the governor's office for about a year, but a part of a much larger portfolio. And then I went out to DOT, and I was out there for 1 year. Now, I would say to you this: I had pretty enormous amount of experience squeezed into a short period of time out there, because I was counsel to the 5 railroad bankruptcies. So I represented the state on the 5 bankruptcies. So you had, you know, Penn Central, Erie, Lackawanna, Reading, Lehigh Valley, and Jersey Central. And there were enormous problems because a couple of those railroads were running the passenger service in New Jersey, and they were all clamoring to get out of passenger service, shut down passenger service. There was all of that. In the meantime, I don't know if many people remember this, but Public Service used to run the bus service in North Jersey. And and they were basically losing their shirt on bus service and wanted to find an exit strategy. But my job became, over the course of that year, to keep them afloat, keep them going for that year. And I would just say this also: there was a very, it was the Department of Transportation, and that had been created by Dave Goldberg, but it was transportation largely in name only, because it was still 95% a highway department and about this much mass transit.
So describe your job as commissioner.
Can I just tell you about how, you asked me before about how I got there. So I went through this. I mean, people kept telling to me, hang in there, this isn't over yet, you may get it, And that came from Lou Thurston, and it came from some other people too. No decision's been made. So I was like hanging on a string, and I had, I had talked to Joyce endlessly about whether this was a smart thing. I was now a partner. I was making more money than Commissioner of Transportation. I was doing pretty well in the law business. And I said, no, I want to do this if it's available, because I really think I could do a good job. And I think, I think it's a right career move for me. And she, Joyce, she's her own person, but we had a lot of talk about it, and we decided we would do it if it came. So what I decided I wouldn't do was lobby for it. I just wouldn't. It just, I was sure that if I did that, it would not come my way. Tom would not be able to deal with that. And I knew I had some history with Tom. Obviously, I had not been with him in a primary. I was not this huge player in the campaign. Even Tom's relationship with Governor Cahill, I think it was worked well. I was perceived as a Cahill guy, I think. I don't know whether he thought of me that way, but that's what I was. So I was kind of hanging on a string, waiting for something to happen. The insurance post had gotten filled. I obviously didn't get that. Thank God. Thank God now. So along comes Vince Cerati one day, and this is about March 1st.
Tell who's Vince Cerati.
Vince Cerati was a legend from the Star Ledger, a State House reporter forever, and a great reporter and a very interesting character, and a man with a tremendous voice who used to do performances at the annual press dinner where they lambasted all the politicians in Trenton. So Vince calls me up one day and he says, John, he says, I have it on unimpeachable authority that you are the next Commissioner of Transportation. I took a deep breath and I said, Vince, I don't know where you're getting this from. Nobody has said a word to me from the front office about the position. Please don't run this story. He said, John, I have to run this story. So what do you mean? He said, I'm telling you, the person who gave me the story has never been wrong. Calls him right every time, always has good information. I believe him. I don't know why you don't know yet, but you're going to be the next Commissioner of Transportation. I said, Vince, if I have any chance at all, this will be the end of it when you run the story. So I got off the phone. I called Lou Thurston. I said, Lou, help me, will you? I mean, if there's something I should know, tell me. If it's, he said, no, there's no decision. I said, then you better get Vince and kill this story. You better kill this story. And Lou did get Vince, and Lou did kill the story. And it was, another couple of weeks went by, and then I had my interview. And then shortly after that, I got a call from the governor's office to come in and meet with them. We had a short meeting. I think the story went as to how they finally got to me was I think the governor finally threw up his hands and said, what the hell, give it to him, give him a shot. So.
Did you ever find out who Vince Cerati's source was?
I did.
Would you care to tell?
I don't recall the name exactly, but it was believe me, this was like really bizarre, far-fetched, impossible, unimpeachable source in the sense that the guy was somebody who sold equipment of some kind, I think snowplows, to the DOT. But he had some connect to Luke Gray, who was the chairman of Somerset County, a renowned Republican chairman of Somerset County. So maybe that gave him some credibility with Vincent. Maybe the guy got lucky on some, or maybe he had some good information. But he sure didn't have this one right.
It's a good story.
Right.
Now describe your job as commissioner. Big responsibility.
I got to tell you one story first.
Okay.
So I go in and sit down with Tom, and he says, I really want you to do this. And I said, I'm delighted to do it. I said, are you going to do a four-way check before you announce it? He says, He says, you know what day it is? This was like April 6th or something like that. And he said, if you got anything to tell me now, because I'm going to announce it this afternoon.
So, all right, for the record, tell us what a four-way check is.
A four-way check is what the state police do to check out serious candidates for important state posts. And they check FBI records and criminal records and just about, and then they do interviews of people that know you. And it's a very thorough examination, but, and, you know, I didn't think I had much to, that I was worried about, but you know, just you never know quite how things are going to be presented when from your past. And so I just asked a question, and he told me flat out, "No, you got anything? Tell me now." So I said, "No, I really don't." So I got sworn in a month later, May 7th. Recall it to the day, and got started. By that time. You know, one of the questions I got asked during the interview, can you support the governor's call for a 5-cent gas tax increase? And I said, yes, of course I can. I think one of the department's biggest problems is money, and this should help to solve the problem. And so, you know, he was in the midst of a big legislative battle by the time I got sworn in. And just to make that part of the story a little shorter, came up one vote short in the Senate.
On the gas tax?
On the gas tax. I believe it had originated as it had to in the Assembly and had passed the Assembly and failed in the Senate.
Now, do you recall were you already commissioner when the gas tax legislation was introduced?
I believe it had been introduced, yes. And it was, as I recall, it was really something that, you know, Carrie Edwards also was very interested in transportation, and I believe that Carrie was the person who was the big push in the front office on the gas tax. So
did you play much of a role once you were commissioner?
I just was out trying to sell it. You know, I was trying to get it over the hump. I, you know, obviously had some good connections with the Republican senators in the Senate because I had been their counsel. Got in a little trouble on my first foray into the battle. I put out we put out some flyers at railroad stations that basically had a list of the legislators they should call, and we're in alphabetical order. And Senator Bubba was at the top of the list. He got I won't say a million calls, but he probably got 100 calls. He went nuts. I had to go to the Senate caucus and make an apology for doing it. But I made my push for the bill, and I got over that.
So what were your responsibilities as commissioner?
Okay, so you have a rather large department that has that basically has by this time had two functions. It had a huge highway department, and it had been, it had been at one time the premier highway department in the world. People used to come from China and from Europe to New Jersey because this was the place where a lot of the initial ideas about what highways should be built, like what the safety standards should be, how they should be built, and the designs of them originated here. I'll just give you a couple. Like four-leaf clovers were originated in New Jersey. Jersey barriers that everybody knows are here. Jug handles. I could go on and on and on, but they had this long, glorious history, and they had built a great highway system then in 1948, when the Constitution passed, there had been a dedicated gas tax up to that point. So there was always good funding for transportation, and they had done a lot of projects. But what happened in 48 was that what was described as the good government movement was that it was zero-based budgeting essentially every year. And so on a highway project, which might take 3, 5, 8 years to build, you could only count on funding for 1 year. And so, so funding at DOT was a huge issue. And that's why the governor tried to attack it with the gas tax. The other thing that had happened is New Jersey Transit had come into being. Lou Gambaccini and some of his young staffers, including Martin Robbins, had put together the concept of New Jersey Transit and had taken over those bankrupt railroads that I had talked about before. And so it was in its formative stage. I mean, they were just starting up, maybe a year or two into it, and they were just beginning to get a handle around the issues. And so we had big issues with the railroad unions over work rules. We had lots of service problems with bad equipment. We had some very very serious issues financially on both the highway department. The highway side of transportation had been basically shut down for the entire 1970s. Once the 68 bond funds were expended, they lost 3 bond issues in the 1970s to the public, and so they essentially had no funds. Plus, the new environmental laws had come in and had set back the whole interstate program and a whole bunch of things. So we had projects stacked up that were promised and everybody thought were going to be built that weren't being built. Fortunately, I had a little money to work with because Lou Gambaccini had gotten a small bond issue passed in 1979, and there were still some funds left from that bond issue. But we had this problem of how we're going to fund this highway program. How are we going to complete the interstates? There were big gaps in the interstate program when I got there. So I went about thinking about how to deal with those issues and hoped that the gas tax would pass because that was really going to be a pretty good solution to the problem. Once it went down, I went back to the drawing boards. Started making sure that the department was clear on what we were going to do. We had, we're going to start building highways again. We're going to figure out how to do it. We're going to have priorities. There's going to be a project list, and we're going to work on them till we get them done. The highest priority being close the gaps in the interstate system. We had a gap, 287 basically from Montville up to Suffern was not there. There was 2 gaps in 78, 10-mile gap in Union County, and a 10-mile gap between east of Phillipsburg to the border into Pennsylvania. Had the big interchange on 295 where 195 and 295 cross wasn't built. That was just nothing. And I'm trying to remember, I think 80 might have been pretty well complete from one end to the other. And then there were, projects like 55, and remind me to tell you a story about 55 because it's very much a Tom Kane story. Route 9, Route 206. I mean, I could just go through one after another that everybody at that time wanted to be built, wanted to be finished, and hadn't been finished. So we set that priority. And the other thing was we had, I remember very early on, probably even during, once the governor announced my name, I actually went over and hung out in the department for a month before I got confirmed, and worked with Ann Canby, who was interim DOT commissioner. One of the issues I remember, both she and Lou Gambaccini told me, look, you got one real problem here that I don't know how you're I don't know how you're going to deal with it, but you better deal with it. Because it's going to come back to haunt you and the governor if it doesn't get taken care of. And it had to do with the electrification of the Morrison-Essex Railroad in Essex County, governor's home county, and it had been built by Thomas Edison in the 30s and hadn't been rehabbed at all up until 1980s. It was a project in the pipeline, but it was having a problem. It was a DOT managed project being built for New Jersey Transit, but they essentially had to rebuild the line while keeping the railroad running. And so you had this big problem of transit trying to operate trains running into DOT's problems with getting the project built. So we can get back to that later, but that was a big issue that we were confronting. So.
Do you want to take a break for 2 minutes?
Sure.
All right.
Hang on 1 second.
Okay.
Take it away.
Yeah, I also am going to. John, just before the break, you were talking about one of the biggest problems was funding.
Right.
And I know that you had a huge role in the creation of a funding source for transportation. Why don't you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, I mean, you have to remember at that time that both houses of the legislature were controlled by the opposition party, the Democrats. And matter of fact, the Speaker of the Assembly was one of my law school classmates, Alan Karcher. And the Majority Leader, John Paul Doyle, was another one of my classmates in law school. So we were now back together again. Alan was, they were both very bright guys, but Alan was a nemesis for Tom Kean. So when you started thinking about how you're going to get through legislation, you had to really find a way. How are we going to get these controlled parties to essentially turn over a lot of funds to a Republican administration to go build a lot of projects? And it was in thinking about how to do that, we first had to design a program that even had a chance of passing, and then we had to get everybody behind it. So I was struggling with exactly how to do this. I knew that you couldn't. We weren't going to go back with a gas tax. I was basically told by the front office, "We're not doing that again. Figure out something else." And we had limped along with some funding. We had there was a project, the I-95 project, which we de-designated that would have gone through Hopewell. There was a bunch of money that we got from that, and some other things that we did. But so we had some funds, and I had some leftover money. So we were doing pretty good in terms of getting projects out that had been stalled for a long time. But we're still struggling with what's the concept of this plan. So it took us quite a while, and ultimately, just one day by happenstance, I don't remember whether you recall this or whether it's been talked about yet, but Bob Huey, who was the commissioner of Environmental Protection, had come out with this idea that had got a little publicity called the Infrastructure Bank. And one day, he had an idea that the way to sell it was not just to make it for the environmental sewer needs and water needs, but also to include transportation. And so he had gotten some help from some, I forget which firm, some Wall Street firm that had helped him sort of conceptualize how they would do this. And he came over to talk to me one day, or when I went there, I forget which, but we had a good discussion about it, but it was pretty clear to me that it wouldn't work in this sense, that in sewer and water, they actually had revenue generated by their projects, so they could have a revolving fund, so the fund could be replenished pretty easily. But in transportation, you build the highway, and unless you toll the highway, which we weren't talking about money for that at all, we already had the turnpike and the parkway and the expressway. This idea of a revolving fund, which was part of this trust fund, wouldn't work. But in the course of that conversation, he started telling me about something I had never heard about before, which were contract bonds, that the state could sell bonds if the legislature would agree to appropriate money every year to support those bonds. And they weren't general obligation bonds, and they had never been done in New Jersey as far as I know. So I took that idea and I had some conversation. I worked with Gary Stein quite closely in the governor's office. Gary was the policy person in the office and was a very smart guy and had some Wall Street experience too. And I believe we worked with Bear Stearns at the time. We decided we would just go with one firm, and we cobbled together this plan that involved some contract bonds, short-term bonds, 10-year bonds. So the idea was that they would be paid off in 10 years, and there would be, you could just renew the program. It dedicated part of the gas tax that already existed to the funding stream, and imposed a new tax on heavy trucks, on the theory that heavy trucks were really the biggest cause of damage to the highways, and they weren't. We felt weren't paying their fair share. So we had these three items, and I knew that we had to do something to make it worth the effort, and so we proposed a $3 billion program. And at that time, it was like, this is $3 billion. Nobody ever talked in those numbers. The last bond issue was $140 million or $190 million, I forget. So we had this big program that we proposed, and we had the financing mechanism all worked out. But I had to get the governor on board for this, and I remember going over. And Gary and I presented it, and Kerry was a little bit standoffish, as I recall, not really sure this was really smart. Greg Stevens by that time had taken over for Lou Thurston, and he was pretty new, so he was kind of listening and learning, and so every once in a while I would call up Greg or Gary, and one day I called up Greg and said, how are we doing? I mean, we're getting pretty close to State of the Union and then a new budget, and what are we going to do? If we're going to get going on this, we got to do it now. And Greg said, let me check. I'll call you back. So I guess there were a lot of talk about it inside one day about different things they were going to do, and I was told, I don't know if this is true, but I was told the governor said, are we going to do that crazy thing Sheridan wants to do? And I guess the answer was yes. And so we went with it. And by this time, we had been through the strike up at Transit, and my staff had started to change and evolve. And one of the guys that I had hired to help me with the strike and the PR on the strike was Jim Weinstein. And so Jim came later when Tom Flynn left, who had been Governor Cale's press secretary, filled in as director of communications, and then ultimately became my chief of staff when Jim Crawford became assistant commissioner. So all names that people may remember that are still around. Jim's back again as head of New Jersey Transit. But Jim helped with the planning of the campaign, and we had this not very high tech now, but we had this combination video PowerPoint presentation that we had put together, and it was pretty good. And we had taken excerpts, and it was the lead piece on the Governor's State of the Union message, as I recall. And then we had taken that and started doing a roadshow, and we had built a pretty good coalition. As I recall, we had just about every labor union, every business in the state was on board. Remember Bob Van Buren, the hungry banker from Mid-Atlantic Bank? Bob Van Buren headed up this coalition, and we had literally hundreds of companies and organizations in the coalition. And and I got on the road, and I went, and I actually saw 117 of the 120 legislators, all in their offices, sometimes one-on-one, sometimes one-on-three, sometimes one-on-two. But I went to all of them, and in the end, while I think there was a lot of wringing of the hands by Senate President John Russo and Alan Karcher, who really didn't want to do this, really didn't want to turn over $3 billion to this Republican governor to start spending on transportation projects. There was so much support behind it. The labor unions that last night that it came up for a vote was right before the budget. It really was part of the budget package. But they were in the State House in force until the wee hours of the morning, and they were running into the caucuses and running into the caucuses. In the end, it passed both houses unanimously. Nobody could not be for it.
And the Transportation Trust Fund was certainly one of the economic planks of the Kane administration's economic recovery program as well, was it not?
Yeah, sure. I mean, the whole idea was, we have all these projects that need to be done, but we could get. Remember, we were in the first year of the Kane administration. We were in a remnants of a serious recession that had happened. It came out of the gas crises of the late 70s and the high inflation and a bunch of other issues. And that I guess President Carter got blamed for, but I'm not sure they were his fault. And Reagan had taken office and was very enthusiastic. But in his first couple of years, he came into office a year before Governor Kane. The recession wasn't getting better fast. But between, this was part, when the governor presented it, he emphasized the transportation piece, but also, the whole economic benefit, the whole idea of putting people to work and getting things going and getting the Jersey economy going again. It was a stimulus package of its day, Yeah.
An interesting lesson to be learned.
Right.
You mentioned briefly, and I'd like you to talk about it a little bit, the rail strike, which also occurred in the early days of the Kane administration.
Before I came to office, the new administration up at New Jersey Transit, which was Jerry Primo and Martin Robbins and many others, including, by the way, my sister happened to be working there at the time. She was a young person in the communications office, which is another story I'll tell you. But she had been there a couple of years by that time, but right at the beginning of when they were formed. But Martin had worked with this firm out of Chicago, I think it was called Lincoln Beal, and they were experts in labor negotiations for railroads, and they had a whole list of work rules that they wanted to accomplish. And so we had talked about, well, okay, we're going to, if we try and get these, it's going to mean a strike, and we know it's a strike. So my thought was, wait a second, if you have a strike and you haven't got a plan on how to take care of the people, you'll get killed. You'll get, the entire, the governor and the legislature will be on our necks in about 2 minutes to get this thing fixed. And so we spent a long time working on a plan, and we had a very, very good plan on paper for taking care of getting all the people into New York. And we had worked the PR side. As I mentioned, I had hired, at the recommendation of Tom Flett, I hired Jim Weinstein to help us with the press. And we had a good press plan. We had some facts on our side that I think we used pretty well, in a sense that there were some, because of the way certain conductors got paid for overtime and double time and whatever. Remember, this is back in the 1980s when this was a lot of money. Some of them were making $90,000 a year. And we used it. We used it, and we clearly won the PR battle in the papers. First, I got to never forget this. The first night, so we have this great plan where people get from New York on path, and then they get on buses, and the buses go out to park and ride lots where people have parked, and so I'm up there in Newark behind Penn Station with Ken Merrin, who was also in the governor's office, who was, I guess, deputy policy chief or deputy counsel, I forget at the time, or special counsel. But Ken and I were up there. Ken was on the transit board too, and we were up there. I don't know what we thought we were going to do, but we were there trying to see if we could help a little bit or make sure everything was okay. It was a total cluster mess. What happened was all the buses came there, but they weren't organized, and they came in from every different street, and they were all like this. And it was pouring rain. It was just pouring. We were out there being drenched. Anyway, they got out of there. We got them out of there eventually, hours later. And by the next night, they had it very well organized, and it went essentially like clockwork. And surprisingly, everybody said, "You're gonna get killed because it won't work that well, people found other ways to get to work or didn't go to work. I don't know which, but essentially it became a non-event.
How long did it last?
7 days, and they caved.
Wow.
We settled. And the governor was very good. He, I'm sure he was sitting in Trenton saying, I don't know if I could take another day, but he was very good. It let it run its course, and we did a very good job at the negotiations. We got a lot of the work rules that we wanted, and very modest, if any, wage increase. I don't even recall, but it was clearly, in terms of how people perceive things, that that we had sort of won the war.
So clearly, you've already spoken about several major issues. Were there other major transportation issues during your time as commissioner?
There were lots of issues over highways, and over
That's one of my questions.
over individual projects. I-95 I mentioned before, that was a huge issue. I recall Route 31 up around Flemington was a big issue, and we had lots of those all over the place. I got to tell you the 55 story.
I was going to say now's the time for the
So
55
this is like the governor was great to work for, because he basically said, keep me involved through my staff and what you're doing. Let me know. Don't get way out in front of me. Make sure I understand what you're doing. But I'm not going to, he wasn't one of those guys who was calling you up every 5 minutes. I need to do this, I need to do that, you need to do this, you need to do that. He wasn't like that. And basically, I think, I thought the cabinet overall did a very good job. And I think it was essentially because his style was not management so much as it was leadership, Here, we're going to be an ethical administration that's going to try and do some very good things, but the vehicle for getting those things done is the ideas that are bubbling up from the department, or ideas that are out there that need to be addressed. And I just thought he did. It was terrific from that point of view. But on this one situation with 55, I was. This was before the trust. I think it was before the trust fund passed, because clearly by the time the trust fund passed, we had one of the tools we used when we put the trust fund out was a book of every single project that needed to be done and when it would be done under the trust fund once it passed. And so we had, when I would go to legislative office, I'd say, here's the 5 things in your district, here's the 10 things in your district, So we had a very clear selling tool. But back to Route 55. Even though I was involved in transportation issues, being from Central and North Jersey, I didn't have that much feel for South Jersey, and apparently the governor had, during some one or more campaign stops, had pretty much pledged that 55, which had been stopped for years and years, was going to get built, and he promised that. But it was sort of unbeknownst to me. I didn't. If I knew it, I didn't remember it. And one day I was at a legislative committee, which I was at regularly. I mean, I got called in before the committees all the time. And somebody asked me about 55, and I said, the 55 is definitely on our list, and we're going to get 55 built. Well, it was headlines in South Jersey when I said that. There were like, the Courier Post and the Gloucester Times and the Vineland paper and the Salem paper. It was like Philadelphia Inquirer. It was headlines. Well, he didn't call, but he had Greg Stevens call, and Greg said, John, what are you doing? This is the governor's project. Don't you think you should be there when you announce this? So, and I had to admit that I had really screwed this one up, but it was innocent enough, but not very smart on my part.
I want to go back to New Jersey Transit for a minute, because you were also chairman of New Jersey Transit. Was that the first time that the Commissioner of Transportation was chair of New Jersey Transit? No,
that's the way Lou Gambasini had designed it, and they did something very smart and unique when they designed New Jersey Transit. In most every transit agency in the country, the people were chosen from different areas of the state. So if you let's say the district included 10 counties. It would be one rep from each county, and that person was there, like a legislative representative. So they were always arguing. It was always arguing about what they needed for their district, and it sort of lost, the higher level view of what's good for the state. And I thought, Lou and Martin Robbins, who thought all that through, had really designed it very well. And so the appointments were all gubernatorial appointments, included the treasurer, and included the commissioner of transportation. And the commissioner of transportation was, right from the get-go, was the chairman of New Jersey Transit. And it was a good way to do it because it really, even though transit had been essentially separated from DOT, it was a good way to pull transportation policy together and make it work together. And I thought it was very well designed. And it was also, the other thing they did is it was not a large group. It was, I think the whole board was 7. So the governor had one appointment. When I was there for a good period of time, had one designee, I should say, who was Ken Marin. And then he had appointments I think there were four appointments that were confirmed, subject to advice and consent of the Senate, with staggered terms. And then there was the treasurer and the DOT commissioner. So, had a lot of administration input, but you didn't control the board, depending on when those appointments had been made. And I thought it was very well thought out.
I want to talk for a minute about the independent transportation authorities, like the Turnpike and the Highway Authority, et cetera. It was very different than it is today. How did you, as commissioner, work with these very powerful independent authorities?
Right now, as you know, the commissioner sits on each of the authorities, and for reasons such we could get into, I never thought that was a great idea, but it was something that happened. I think that it came in the latter part of the Kane administration when Hazel was commissioner. Hazel Gluck was commissioner, and that was the first foray into that area. But when I was there, Bo Sullivan was chairman of the Turnpike Authority. He was a very powerful chairman, and didn't seem to much care what the Department of Transportation thought. And frankly, they were not big on my list of things to worry about. The Parkway had Gallagher, I believe, was the executive later Senator Gallagher, and I forget who was at the Atlantic City Expressway, but they were independent, and they ran very independently, and so it was a burden I didn't have to worry about at the time, and I didn't worry about it very much.
Did you work with the federal government to bring federal transportation funding?
Yeah, that was a very big part of what we had to do because we were subject to getting federal funds. A lot of the $3 billion program that I talked about, I'm guessing right now, but I would say maybe a third of it was state money, and the rest of it was federal monies that were combined with state monies. And one of the problems we had, and one of the reasons we needed funding, was we had available federal monies, but if you didn't have the match, you couldn't get it. And New Jersey was always, all during the 70s, way behind on taking down its match. And some of those funds were always threatening to go to Wyoming or Texas or whatever. And so that was a big part of the selling package on trying to get the funds. And the key person for us on that was first, while I was there, was Jim Howard, because he was we had a very powerful congressman from Monmouth County who was chairman of the House Public Works Committee, and I got to work with him very closely. And we had. Ultimately, it all worked out. It was not always an easy road, because they were They were the chairman of that committee was an absolute powerhouse, and then of course you had the senators. I had Senator Bradley and Senator Lautenberg when he was a very young senator.
Let's focus on Governor Kane and what he was like to work with. You talked a little bit about how he was a leader, and I like that quote, and he didn't manage. What were his major strengths in addition to his leadership style?
Well,
his weaknesses. Why don't you talk about strengths?
Yeah, I had a hard time adjusting to Tom's style. I had worked for Governor Cahill, and Governor Cahill was very much direct. Pretty much knew where he stood on most issues. He could be very tough at times, and Tom was, I won't say aloof, but he was, he was standoffish a little bit in the sense that, you weren't always sure where he was on issues. And I think, it took me a long time to figure out that he was just way ahead of all of us, most of the people in the State House on every issue, and he would just he had him. It seemed later to me when I look back on it, even while I was there, but looking back on a few months earlier, his timing was impeccable. He could always pick the right time to be there on an issue, and he was a master at it. It was just very good. And I guess the other thing about Tom was he was basically extremely well grounded, I think, in terms of what he believed in, and what are his core principles. I would say, it was there was just some inner strength there that he had, and he just stuck to it in his own not belligerent way, but his own firm way. He could be very immovable on something when he wanted to be immovable.
What would you say his major weaknesses were?
I think early on I was concerned that he was not combative enough. Alan Karcher was an in-your-face politician. He used to come down. It seemed to me, now I wasn't in the State House, I was out in West Trenton, so I didn't see this every day, but it just seemed to me from reading the papers in that first 6, 8, 10 months that Karcher was just down in front of that office at 4 o'clock every afternoon, raising hell about some damn thing. And maybe it was the Irish in me, but I wanted to. Why doesn't he put the boxing gloves on and punch him back? In the end, he was very right about it. And I think the big turning point. The first year was a very tough year. I remember going to a cabinet meeting sometime in late summer, and we were all reeling. It was we had lost the gas tax, and everybody was when are we gonna start doing some good stuff, and how are we ever gonna get to deal with these crazy Democrats in the Assembly and the Senate? How are we ever gonna get something going? And we just all wringing our hands. And then Tom was hospitalized for several weeks. It seemed like several weeks. I don't know if it was that long, with back problems. And it was. Everybody was sort of like, I think, reeling a bit. At some point in time, and I don't remember exactly when it was, Greg Stevens came to the office, and I think he was first there as some role in communications before he was chief of staff. But I don't know how this all happened because I wasn't in the front office to know exactly how it happened. But Greg got him out there, got Tom out of Trenton more, got him out to the towns. And Tom had a very nice way about himself with people. He would stand and linger talking to reporters and talking to people. He was just a very good conversationalist on issues, a very warm person. And after a while, people got to see the real Tom Kane. He wasn't just this guy that they were reading about out in, up in Trenton where Karcher was beating him up every day in the press. And things started to turn. I would say by the end of the first year, it seemed to me he was on a roll. And So fast forward to after the trust fund passes, and so remember, now all the labor unions are, fully supportive of the trust fund, and we get work. We had work piled up, and we got work right out on the street. We did an enormous paving program in the first year, and put a lot of construction workers to work. This would have been in 84, so it would have been late summer, fall of 84, and into the spring of 85. But right after the bill passed, Richie Tessier, who was head of the heavy and general construction workers who were housed up in Newark, said, "Why don't you come up to the labor hall? I want to just introduce you to our folks." So, I had gotten fairly friendly with the labor people during this, and I said, "Sure, I'll go. I'm glad to come up." So I went up to Newark, and they had one of their meetings. There were 800 people in this town, in this hall up in Newark, and they were busting at the seams. And Richie gets up there and says, "I want to introduce the Commissioner of Transportation. This is the guy that's going to send your kids to college," right? And the place goes berserk, So, and I said, "What, Richie? Why don't you have the governor here?" He says, "We'll do that next week." They did the whole thing again 2 weeks later for Tom Kane. I mean, Tom. Look, Tom got this thing done. There's no commissioner of transportation. I could go around and see everybody, I could do all that stuff. But in the end, without the governor's leadership, without him out there going to the editorial boards and dealing with the leadership in the legislature and dealing with the labor unions and all that, this never would have happened. And so, to the extent that I played a role, and I'm very proud of it, but I know these things don't happen unless the governor's there for you. Unless the governor had put it in a State of the Union message, unless he had stayed with it, it wouldn't have happened.
What would you say were his greatest weaknesses?
Well, I started to tell you that I saw as a weakness him standing back from a fight at times, and it was just that I didn't understand him, So
it turned into a strength.
It really was a strength, I don't know that I don't know that Tom had any real, serious weaknesses in terms of. He was clearly a leader, and I think that job is not a management job; it's a leadership job. I mean, if you try to manage it, it's too big. Nobody can do it. You need to be able to let everybody know what you're trying to do, and then let other people do it.
You alluded before to staff personalities, and Tom Kane was known for embracing contradictory opinions within his staff and maybe even within his cabinet. Yeah. Talk a little bit about the personalities in the governor's staff.
Well, see, that was sort of something that I think was part of what I was perceiving as, a bit of a weakness. Why would he have all these people letting them do all this stuff? It was just it was his way of learning and understanding all the facets of an issue, and so you had very strong personality in Kerry Edwards in the office, and you had Steady Eddie as the chief of staff, Lou Thurston, and then you had Gary Stein, who was bright as hell and a very even keel personality though, but who was trying to make it all work. I'm sure he was mediating all day long on issues, and Kerry was a tough guy to deal with. If you let him go, he would just take over everything. A couple of times I thought he was. He was really thinking maybe he was the commissioner of transportation. So, but anyway, so I know we used to hear these stories, and they didn't change all that much when Lou left, and and Craig Stevens took over. I think that pounding worked. But you know what? All I can say is overall the first term, which is the term I was there, was a very successful term for the governor.
That was going to be my next question. How would you assess the Kane administration as a whole when you were there, also when you left, and what were his greatest victories? Clearly, you talked about Transportation Trust Fund, but from your perspective.
Well, I thought he did great things in education. I thought he did. He was very good environmental governor. I mean, he was early to some of those issues. He understood them. He spent a lot of time thinking about them. He got the economy going. I mean, I think from a tax policy point of view and from a economic development point of view, and including some of the things we did in transportation, maybe he caught a wave a little bit, but certainly a lot of credit goes to him and that administration in the first few years of kicking up the state economy, and that served the state very well all the way up until Tom left office in '89.
What were, beyond the gas tax, what were his most disappointing defeats?
Yeah, I'm trying to remember. There's nothing that jumps out at me. I'm probably just having memory failure here, but because I'm sure there were some, but nothing that's popping into my mind at the moment.
Now, why did you leave after 3 years?
Okay, so this is some interesting stories. So, I was a lawyer. I had. When I went in, I had 4 children. The children were clicking along in age, so I was not far away from college years. I would have stayed if I could have been Attorney General, and I'll tell you a couple stories. So, sometime even before the trust fund passed. Tony Ciccatello and Larry Bathgate came to see me and said, they led me to believe they had some conversations with the governor, and they were all contemplating making some changes in it. Erwin Kimmelman would go back to private practice and or to the bench or someplace, and John Sheridan would be AG, and Roger Bladman would become Commissioner of Transportation. And that, in terms of a career path, that was very attractive to me. I thought that was great, and I told him, of course, if the governor wanted me to do that, I would be happy to do it. Never knew the real story, but it didn't happen. Just nothing changed, and never had another conversation about it. So I was thinking about the next term, what was going to happen. Tom was likely to get reelected. But I was sure Erwin Kimmelman was going to leave the administration. But I was looking around. I said, well, to me, the obvious person to go to the AG's office is Kerry Edwards. I mean, he's worked with the governor day in and day out. He's done a yeoman's job in that office. Kerry was very good with the legislature. He understood the issues. He could talk to them. He had been there before. He was just very good on that stuff. And to me, there was no way the governor was going to say, okay, let's make John Sheridan AG and Kerry Edwards, you stay here or go away. It's not going to happen. And I had kind of figured it out. And so right after the trust fund passed, and I thought we had gotten the Morrison Electric project that I talked about before was done, which I have to tell you a funny story about too, but a good Tom Kane story. But I had gotten that done. We had gotten the money in place. The projects we were going to do were all lined up. You could see that it was pretty well set. The department who had had been perceived as a lousy department, was now the talk of Trenton. They couldn't do nothing wrong. They were, and in fact, I should tell you this, when I first went to DOT, was going there, I must have had half of the transportation industry tell me, you've got to clean house, you've got to start over out at DOT. And I remember sitting there talking to them, a group of about 30, and I said, it ain't happening. I've been in that department. I know those people. There are some great people in that department. They just need to know what they're supposed to do, and they'll do it. Nah, you don't know what you're talking about. I said, well, give me a while, let me see. I'm telling you what I'm going to do. I am not going to tear the place apart and then find out 2 years from now we have nothing done. So, and it was a great department. It was a fabulous department. And, the administration used to turn to us for can you do this? Yes. Can you do that? Yes. There was always somebody there that could figure it out and do it, and we helped out in so many ways. But I lost my train of thought. I got off on
why you left.
Why I left. So anyway, I was sizing up the situation. I was trying to plan my life. So I didn't see a career path. At one point in time, the opportunity was discussed about going to executive director of the Port Authority in New York and New Jersey, and I said yes, I would be interested in that. It would be a good step for me, and that was far-fetched because New Jersey has never, in the long history of the Port Authority, except in one acting situation, had the executive director as a New Jersey spot. So it wasn't real discussion in the end. So that was another thing that didn't happen. So I was trying to figure what to do. Anyway, so I, knowing that I was going to leave, I said, well, it was August. I went to Greg Stevens and I said, look, I'm going to leave. I'm going to leave in the spring of next year. I'm going to get this construction program going, and then I'm going to leave. Yeah. Come back and talk to us later, So I said, just please tell the governor, will you? So in February, I called up and said, Greg, I'm going to leave. I'm going to leave on May 7th, my 3rd anniversary. Just wanted you to know. He said, you can come in and talk to me and the governor. So I came in. And it was a lot of this, maybe you'll be, not from the governor, but from staff, maybe you'll be AG. I said, come on. It's not happening. Don't promise me something you can't promise. And so where are you going? I said, I don't know what I'm going to do. What do you mean? I said, I'll get a job. I'm just want to give you advance notice. I want to announce it publicly that I'm going to leave, and then I'll over the next couple of months I'll get a job. I don't know what I'm going to do. Come on. So I don't know that either the governor or Greg believed me, but by that time Gary Stein had gone to the court, and so shortly thereafter, sometime earlier than February, maybe in January, Gary and I were pretty close, and I had told him that I was going to go, and I told him about my conversation earlier in the year, and so Gary had said something to Marie Garibaldi, and Marie Garibaldi called Bill Hyland, and Bill Hyland called me. So as it turned out, I had once the announcement went out, I had Bill Hyland called me right after that, and we actually met on the Washington train trip in early February, whatever that date that was, and we had a little conversation, and that led to more conversation. But I was also talking to other firms, like Carter and English and Kraft and Hughes and a couple of others, and one engineering firm that wanted to make me president. So anyway, so long story short, after several interviews with Riker Danzig, and I remember one where I was going up to meet Pete Peretti, who was a senior partner, one of the named partners, on a Sunday afternoon. And this was about my 6th or 7th interview. And Joyce, wise guy that she is, she says, who are you going to meet with, the cleaning lady today? So, at any rate, So it was I had a great, it was a great fit for me. They were a great firm, and I was fortunate. I built quite a good practice there.
John, you've had a very, very successful and varied career. It's really been a pleasure talking to you today, and I thank you very, very much for your time.
Thank you so much, Nancy.
Thanks.